You will address me as Madame Farah at all times, and you will never, ever look me directly in the eyes when I am speaking to you." The words dripped with condescension as Farah al-Rashid stood in the marble foyer of her $30 million Manhattan penthouse, her designer heels clicking against the imported Italian stone as she circled the newest addition to her household staff. In the past 18 months, 27 housekeepers had walked out of this same foyer, some lasting mere hours, before they could no longer tolerate the systematic humiliation that Farah considered normal treatment for domestic help. But the young black woman standing before her, shoulders straight and eyes alert, was different in ways that Farah could never have imagined, and their first encounter would set in motion events that would transform both their lives in the most unexpected ways possible. Keisha Johnson had taken the position knowing exactly what she was walking into, because she had done something that none of the previous housekeepers had thought to do. She had researched her potential employer with the thoroughness of someone whose life had taught her that preparation was the difference between survival and destruction. At 29, Keisha possessed a master's degree in social work from Howard University, certification in conflict resolution, and 5 years of experience working with victims of domestic abuse in shelters across Washington, D.C. The housekeeper position was not a career change but a carefully calculated mission, because Farah al-Rashid was not just another wealthy employer with an attitude problem. The research had led Keisha through public records, society page articles, and interviews with former household staff who had been willing to share their experiences. What emerged was a pattern of psychological manipulation and systematic degradation that went far beyond the typical challenges of working for demanding wealthy clients. Previous employees described an environment of constant criticism, impossible standards, and deliberate humiliation, designed to break down their sense of self-worth and dignity. But beneath these surface details, Keisha had detected signs of something deeper and more complex than simple cruelty. The al-Rashid family fortune had been built on oil wealth spanning 3 generations, but Farah's personal history told a different story entirely. Born Fatima Hassan in a rural village outside Damascus, she had been sold into marriage at 16 to a man 40 years her senior, a transaction that her family had disguised as an honor, but which had actually been driven by desperate poverty and cultural traditions that treated women as property rather than people. Her husband's death 10 years later had left her wealthy but emotionally shattered, carrying trauma that she had never processed and pain that she had learned to inflict on others as a way of maintaining the control that had been stolen from her in youth. The transformation from village girl to Manhattan socialite had required Farah to reinvent herself completely, adopting new mannerisms, speech patterns, and social behaviors that would allow her to navigate elite American society. But the process had also required her to bury her authentic self so deeply that she had lost touch with her own humanity, creating a persona that was polished and sophisticated, but fundamentally hollow. The cruelty she showed to household staff was her way of ensuring that no one could get close enough to see the vulnerable, frightened woman beneath the carefully constructed facade. The previous housekeepers were lazy, incompetent people who had no understanding of what it means to work for a family of our caliber, Farah continued, her accent carrying the crisp precision of someone who had spent years training herself to sound sophisticated rather than vulnerable. They complained about perfectly reasonable expectations, they questioned my instructions, and they had the audacity to think that their comfort mattered more than their duties. Keisha listened, without responding, her trained eye taking in details that would have been invisible to previous employees who had seen only the surface cruelty without understanding the deeper currents of pain and fear that drove Farah's behavior. The way Farah held her shoulders revealed chronic tension. The slight tremor in her hands suggested anxiety that had been suppressed for years, and the careful distance she maintained from physical contact indicated trauma responses that had never been addressed through proper therapy or support. What none of the previous housekeepers had understood was that Farah's cruelty was not born from inherent evil, but from a desperate attempt to maintain control in a world that had taught her that vulnerability meant destruction. Her treatment of domestic staff was a twisted recreation of the power dynamics that had once victimized her, a way of ensuring that she would never again be the powerless person in any relationship. But Keisha recognized these patterns because she had seen them countless times in the women she had worked with in domestic violence shelters, women who had survived abuse only to struggle with the complex aftermath of trauma. The recognition came from her own family history as well, because Keisha's grandmother had survived domestic violence in the 1950s, when resources for abused women were virtually non-existent and social attitudes blamed victims rather than perpetrators. She had watched her grandmother struggle with the psychological aftermath of trauma, the way survival mechanisms that had once been necessary became destructive patterns that damaged relationships with people who meant no harm. Understanding this generational cycle of trauma had motivated Keisha to dedicate her career to breaking these patterns and helping women heal from experiences that might otherwise define them forever. Your room is in the basement level, and you will use the service elevator exclusively, Farah announced, leading Keisha through the penthouse with the air of someone conducting a military inspection rather than a house tour. You will be here every day at 6 a.m. sharp, and you will not leave until I dismiss you for the evening, which will rarely be before 10 p.m. You will eat only the meals I designate for staff, you will not use any of the main bathrooms, and you will certainly never presume to sit on any of the furniture. The rules were designed to dehumanize, to establish a hierarchy that placed Farah firmly in control and reduced her employees to the status of invisible servants whose comfort and dignity were irrelevant considerations. Previous housekeepers had either rebelled against these conditions, leading to immediate termination, or had endured them until the psychological toll became unbearable. But Keisha had a different strategy, one based on her understanding of trauma psychology and her experience helping women heal from systematic abuse. The basement room that would serve as her quarters was spartanly furnished with a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a single chair, deliberately designed to reinforce the message that domestic staff were not worthy of comfort or consideration. The space felt more like a prison cell than employee housing, but Keisha had lived in worse conditions during her college years, when financial aid barely covered basic expenses. She understood that accepting these conditions was part of a larger strategy that required short-term sacrifice for long-term transformation. The penthouse itself was a monument to wealth and taste, with priceless art covering the walls, furniture that belonged in museums, and views of Central Park that represented the pinnacle of Manhattan luxury living. But Keisha could see beyond the material splendor to the emotional emptiness that pervaded every room, the lack of personal warmth or genuine human connection that made the space feel more like an elaborate prison than a home. Every detail had been chosen for its cost and status, rather than its ability to bring joy or comfort, reflecting a woman who had learned to measure worth through external validation rather than internal peace. You will find that I have very specific standards for cleanliness and organization, Farah continued as they moved through the various rooms. Every surface must be spotless. Every item must be returned to its exact designated location, and any deviation from my instructions will result in immediate termination. I do not tolerate laziness, excuses, or the kind of entitled attitude that seems to be common among your kind of people. The racist undertone was delivered with casual precision, designed to establish not just professional hierarchy, but racial superiority, another tool in Farah's arsenal of control mechanisms. She had learned that attacking people's identity and dignity was an effective way to keep them off balance and submissive, a technique that had worked with previous employees who had been too shocked or demoralized to respond effectively. But Keisha had faced racism her entire life, from teachers who had lowered expectations because of her skin color, to employers who had questioned her qualifications despite her obvious competence. She had developed the emotional armor necessary to deflect such attacks while maintaining focus on her larger objectives, and she understood that responding to Farah's provocations with anger or defensiveness would only reinforce the dynamic that the older woman was trying to establish. "I understand your expectations, Mrs. Al-Rashid," Keisha replied calmly, using the slight mispronunciation of Farah's preferred title as a subtle signal that she was not as easily intimidated as previous employees. "I'm here to do excellent work, and I'm confident that my performance will meet your standards." The response was not what Farah had expected, lacking both the submissive deference she demanded and the angry reaction that would have justified immediate termination. For the first time since the interview began, she studied Keisha more carefully, taking in the quiet confidence, the educated speech patterns, and the way the younger woman carried herself with dignity, despite the deliberately humiliating circumstances. "We shall see," Farah said finally, her tone suggesting skepticism about Keisha's ability to survive in an environment that had broken so many others. "Your first task will be to clean and reorganize the library, and I expect it to be completed to perfection by this evening. Any books that are not returned to their exact proper positions will result in penalties being deducted from your salary." The library assignment was a test, because Farah had deliberately disorganized the room's 3,000 books to create an impossible task that would allow her to demonstrate her power through criticism and punishment. Previous housekeepers had struggled with the assignment for days, becoming increasingly frustrated and demoralized as Farah found fault with every attempt at organization until they eventually quit in despair or were fired for failing to meet impossible standards. But as Keisha surveyed the deliberately chaotic library, she recognized the psychological game being played and understood that the real challenge was not organizational, but emotional. The books themselves were valuable first editions and rare volumes, but they had been scattered and misplaced, not through carelessness, but through deliberate manipulation designed to create frustration and helplessness in whoever attempted to restore order. Instead of beginning the impossible task immediately, Keisha did something that no previous housekeeper had attempted. She began to study the books themselves, reading titles and authors, understanding the collection as a reflection of its owner's interests and psychology. What she discovered was revealing, because hidden among the expensive volumes were books on trauma recovery, domestic violence, and women's rights in Middle Eastern cultures, suggesting that Farah was not entirely unconscious of her own psychological struggles. The discovery of these books provided Keisha with crucial insight into Farah's internal world, revealing a woman who was aware of her trauma but had no framework for healing or support system for recovery. The volumes on women's rights were particularly telling, because they suggested that Farah understood intellectually that her treatment of other women contradicted her own feminist beliefs, creating cognitive dissonance that she resolved through increasingly rigid control mechanisms. As Keisha worked through the afternoon, organizing the books with methodical precision, while also noting which volumes showed signs of recent reading, Farah appeared periodically to inspect the progress and deliver criticism. But instead of the frustrated defensive responses she had learned to expect, Keisha received each critique with calm professionalism, implementing suggestions without argument, while maintaining her own dignity and sense of purpose. "This section is completely wrong," Farah announced during her third inspection, pointing to a carefully organized shelf of Middle Eastern literature. "These books should be arranged by publication date, not alphabetically by author. How could you make such an obvious mistake?" "I apologize for the confusion," Keisha replied evenly. "I'll reorganize this section according to your preference. Would you like the publication dates to include both original and translation dates for the works that were originally published in Arabic?" The question caught Farah off guard, because it revealed that Keisha had actually been reading the books rather than simply moving them around, and had noticed that many of the volumes were translations of classical Arabic literature. No previous housekeeper had demonstrated any interest in or knowledge of the intellectual content of the collection, and the realization that Keisha was engaging with the material on a deeper level created an unexpected moment of connection. "You can read Arabic?" Farah asked, her tone shifting slightly from condescension to curiosity. "I studied Middle Eastern literature in college," Keisha replied, which was true but incomplete, because her real familiarity with Arabic culture came from her work with refugee women who had fled domestic violence in their home countries. "I find the poetry particularly beautiful, especially the works that deal with women's experiences of displacement and identity." The reference to women's displacement struck Farah with unexpected force, because it touched on themes that resonated deeply with her own experience of cultural transition and identity confusion. She had spent years constructing a new persona as a wealthy American socialite, but the process had required her to suppress and deny the young woman she had once been, creating internal conflicts that she had never learned to resolve in healthy ways. "Most people have no appreciation for the complexity of Arabic literature," Farah said, her voice losing some of its harsh edge as she found herself engaging in actual conversation rather than delivering instructions. "They see only stereotypes and assume that our culture produces nothing of intellectual value. That's a terrible loss for them," Keisha replied. "Some of the most powerful writing I've ever encountered has come from Arab women authors who write about surviving difficult circumstances and finding strength in unexpected places." The conversation continued for several minutes, the longest genuine interaction Farah had experienced with domestic staff in years, and it revealed aspects of her personality that had been buried under layers of defensive cruelty. When she talked about literature and culture, her voice became animated and intelligent, showing glimpses of the woman she might have been if her life had taken different turns. But as the conversation deepened, Farah seemed to remember her established role, and abruptly returned to her previous demeanor. "Enough conversation," she said sharply. "You're here to work, not to socialize. Finish the library properly, and then begin dinner preparations. I expect the meal to be served at exactly 8 p.m. The sudden shift back to cruelty was jarring, but Keisha recognized it as a defense mechanism rather than genuine hostility. Farah had allowed herself a moment of vulnerability and connection, but her survival instincts had kicked in to re-establish the emotional barriers that protected her from potential hurt or disappointment. It was a pattern that Keisha had observed in many trauma survivors who had learned that closeness meant danger. Over the following weeks, Keisha settled into the demanding routine that Farah had established, but she approached each task with a perspective that previous housekeepers had lacked. Instead of viewing the unreasonable demands and constant criticism as personal attacks, she understood them as symptoms of deeper psychological wounds that required patience and strategic intervention rather than direct confrontation. The other household staff, a rotating cast of part-time workers who handled specific functions like gardening and maintenance, watched Keisha with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment as she endured treatment that had driven away so many others. But what they didn't understand was that Keisha was not simply enduring Farah's behavior, she was systematically documenting patterns and developing strategies based on her professional training in trauma recovery. Each day brought new tests and challenges, as Farah searched for the breaking point that would allow her to dismiss Keisha and maintain her pattern of emotional isolation. The dinner preparations became increasingly elaborate. The cleaning standards grew more impossibly precise, and the personal criticisms became more pointed and cruel, as Farah struggled to provoke the angry reaction that would justify termination. "Your cooking is mediocre at best," Farah announced one evening, after a meal that had taken Keisha 6 hours to prepare, according to impossible specifications. "In my home country, servants who produced such inferior food would be dismissed immediately. Perhaps you simply lack the intelligence necessary to follow complex instructions." The insult was designed to attack both Keisha's professional competence and her racial identity, combining classism with racism in a way that had proven effective at destroying previous employees' self-esteem. But Keisha had anticipated such escalation and had prepared responses that would deflect the attack while potentially opening space for genuine communication. "I appreciate your feedback," Keisha replied calmly. "Cooking is definitely a skill that improves with practice and guidance. If you have specific techniques or family recipes that you'd like me to learn, I'd be grateful for the instruction." The response was designed to acknowledge Farah's expertise while refusing to accept the premise that Keisha was inherently inferior, and it had the unexpected effect of reminding Farah of her own grandmother, who had taught her to cook during the few happy moments of her childhood before marriage had ended her education and independence. "My grandmother made the most beautiful kibbeh," Farah said softly, her voice taking on a wistful quality that revealed glimpses of the young woman she had once been. She would spend entire days preparing it for special occasions, and the whole house would smell like home. "That sounds wonderful," Keisha replied, recognizing the opportunity to encourage Farah's positive memories. Food can carry so much emotional meaning, especially recipes that connect us to people we love. For a moment, Farah's carefully constructed barriers seemed to dissolve as she remembered the warmth and security of her grandmother's kitchen, a sharp contrast to the cold perfection of her current home. But the vulnerability was too threatening, and she quickly reasserted her defensive posture. "Enough sentimentality," she said harshly. "Clean the kitchen properly and then retire to your quarters. I don't want to see you again until morning." But despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance, Farah found herself thinking about the conversation as she sat alone in her perfectly appointed living room, surrounded by luxury, but devoid of the warmth and connection that her grandmother's simple kitchen had provided. The realization that she had recreated the isolation and control that had once victimized her was too painful to examine directly, but it planted seeds of awareness that would continue to grow. As weeks turned into months, Keisha's strategy of patient consistency began to produce unexpected results. Farah's attacks became less frequent and less vicious, not because she had lost interest in maintaining control, but because Keisha's refusal to be broken or provoked was forcing her to confront the futility of her behavior patterns. The young woman's persistent dignity and competence were undermining the worldview that had allowed Farah to justify her cruelty. The breakthrough came on a particularly difficult day, when Farah received news that her estranged sister had died in Syria, leaving behind 3 young children with no surviving family members to care for them. The loss triggered a grief response that she had spent years suppressing, and for the first time since Keisha had known her, Farah's carefully maintained composure completely collapsed. Keisha found her employer sitting on the floor of the library, surrounded by the same books that had once been used as instruments of psychological torture, crying with the raw intensity of someone who had finally run out of strength to maintain her defenses. It was a moment of complete vulnerability that could have been exploited for revenge or dismissed with indifference. But Keisha's response revealed the true purpose of her patient endurance. "Mrs. Al-Rashid," Keisha said softly, approaching slowly to avoid startling the grieving woman. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Is there anything I can do to help?" The offer of comfort from someone she had systematically mistreated was so unexpected that Farah couldn't immediately process it. In her experience, kindness was always conditional, always came with expectations or demands for reciprocation, and she waited for Keisha to reveal whatever advantage she hoped to gain from this moment of weakness. But no demands came, no attempts to exploit the situation or extract concessions. Instead, Keisha simply sat nearby, offering silent presence and support, while Farah processed the complicated grief of losing someone she had loved, despite years of forced separation and cultural barriers that had made communication dangerous. "She was my little sister," Farah whispered finally, her voice breaking with pain that had been bottled up for decades. "I tried to protect her, but I couldn't. I failed her, just like I've failed everyone who ever mattered to me." The confession revealed the core wound that had driven years of defensive cruelty. the guilt and self-blame that had convinced Farah that she was fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love or connection. It was a narrative that many abuse survivors carried, the internalized message that their victimization had been somehow their fault, and that they were inherently damaged beyond repair. "You didn't fail her," Keisha said gently. "You were both victims of circumstances beyond your control. Surviving doesn't make you responsible for what happened to people you couldn't save." The words were precisely what Farah needed to hear, but had never allowed herself to believe. And they opened a conversation that continued for hours as years of suppressed pain and trauma finally found expression. Keisha listened with the skill of a trained counselor, offering validation and support while carefully avoiding the kind of advice or judgment that might cause Farah to retreat back into defensive isolation. As dawn approached, Farah found herself telling the story she had never shared with anyone. The arranged marriage that had stolen her adolescence, the years of abuse that had taught her that survival required the complete suppression of vulnerability, and the guilt that had consumed her since gaining freedom while so many other women remained trapped in similar circumstances. "I became everything I once hated," Farah admitted, as the sun rose over Central Park. "I treated you and all the others the way I was treated, and I told myself it was normal, that it was just how the world worked. But you never broke, never stopped being kind, and I couldn't understand how that was possible." Keisha's response revealed the true purpose of her months of patient endurance, the reason she had accepted a position that no one else could tolerate. "I stayed because I recognized something in you that you couldn't see in yourself. Under all the pain and anger, there's a woman who survived incredible trauma and still has the capacity for healing and growth. I believe that woman deserved a chance to emerge." The transformation that followed was not immediate or magical, but it was profound and lasting. Farah began therapy for the first time in her life, working with specialists in trauma recovery to process decades of suppressed pain and develop healthier coping mechanisms. She started donating to organizations that helped women escape domestic violence, using her wealth to provide the kind of support that she had never received. Most importantly, she began to treat her household staff and everyone around her with the dignity and respect that she had never shown before. Recognizing that her previous behavior had been a reflection of her own unhealed wounds rather than any inherent superiority. The penthouse, that had once felt like an emotional prison, became a space where healing and growth were possible. Keisha remained in Farah's employment for 2 more years, but their relationship evolved from employer and servant to mentor and student, with both women learning from each other about resilience, healing, and the possibility of transformation even after the most devastating trauma. When Keisha finally left to start her own nonprofit organization focused on helping domestic violence survivors, Farah provided both financial backing and ongoing support. The woman who had driven away 27 housekeepers through systematic cruelty had been transformed by the patient wisdom of someone who understood that healing was possible even for those who seemed irredeemably damaged. Keisha's impossible achievement was not in surviving Farah's abuse, but in seeing past it to the wounded human being beneath and providing the kind of unconditional support that made recovery possible. Years later, when Farah spoke at conferences about domestic violence and trauma recovery, she would always credit the young black housekeeper who had refused to give up on her, who had seen potential for healing where everyone else saw only cruelty. The impossible had become reality through the power of patient love and professional expertise, proving that even the most damaged relationships could be transformed when approached with wisdom, courage, and an unshakable belief in human dignity. The penthouse still overlooked Central Park, still contained priceless art and museum-quality furniture, but it had become something entirely different, a home where healing was valued more than perfection, where vulnerability was safe, and where the impossible transformation of one broken woman had created ripple effects that would continue helping others for generations to come.